Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this event. I'm really pleased with the turnout, especially since we're getting 1 to 3 inches of snow this evening. So thanks for coming out for this. This is the inaugural Bellisario Fellows Symposium. The Fellows are a distinguished group of high-achieving students representing all of the majors in the Donald P. Bellisario College of Communications. Tonight's panel will feature 3 distinguished faculty from that college. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Dean Marie Harden for her vision to establish the Fellows Program. And the program would not have been possible without the generous $30 million gift from Don and Vivian Bellisario, to name the college. I also want to recognize Jackie Jamison Safara and her husband Steve Safara, 2 Penn State alums whose ongoing support for the Fellows makes programs like this possible. And I also want to give a special thanks to Jeff Knapp, the Foster Communications Librarian, for his assistance in setting up this event, and Emily Miller, who helps administer the Fellows Program. Last, but certainly not least, I would like to acknowledge the Bellisario Fellows who are here tonight for their participation in the program. Fellows, would you please stand? So this is a distinguished group, and as one example of that, it's now my great pleasure to introduce Jade Campos, who's one of our graduating fellows, who's going to introduce tonight's topic. Jade is graduating as a Schreyer Honors student with a major in journalism and a double minor in French and media studies. She is also the Bellisario College's College Marshal for next month's commencement ceremony. That is the top honor bestowed on a graduating senior. She is also the outgoing editor-in-chief of the Daily Collegian and a proud member of the Blue Band. So let's give Jade a hand for all of it. Jade, thank you.
All right, hello everybody. How are you tonight? It's really cold. Was not expecting this today. So I'm here to introduce the topic for you guys. I'm sure that some of you already know about the information that we're going to be discussing tonight since you're here, but if you're not, I'm going to be giving a little bit of an introduction to kind of give us some background before we start the discussion for the night. Let's get right into it. So if you don't know who Joe Rogan is, he is a podcast host of the infamous podcast, as it is now, of the Joe Rogan Experience. It's become a little bit controversial over the past few months, which is what we'll get into tonight. But the podcast is available on Spotify along with other streaming platforms and often discusses politics and science. So what exactly was it that happened, which is what we'll be discussing tonight and is the topic of our presentation. So in late 2021, in December, going into early 2022, the podcast caused a lot of controversy because Joe Rogan invited Dr. Robert Malone, who is a physician and a biochemist, onto the show. Throughout the pandemic, he's spoken a lot about sharing some vaccine hesitancy, spreading misinformation about COVID-19 as well. And so on the podcast, he was asked to talk about COVID vaccine hesitancy, and it was a 3-hour-long episode where they discussed many different topics relating to the pandemic, particularly with the vaccine. And after it came out, a lot of medical professionals debunked information in the podcast as being falsehoods. And one of the most controversial things about the episode was that there were some comparisons made between the vaccine to Nazi medical experiments. And so following the publishing of the podcast episode, a lot of people, including medical professionals, were calling for the episode to be taken down, along with a couple of other Joe Rogan Experience podcast episodes that had been released in the past that were kind of brought up into light considering the controversy that was created surrounding this particular episode. So I have a couple of quotes specifically here that kind of help sum up some of the things that were talked about, some of the most controversial things that were said during the episode. The first thing is a kind of back and forth between Rogan and his guest. You can read it there, but it's pretty much both of them saying that they saw Joe Biden, who's our current president, get the vaccine, and they believed that it was fake, that he didn't actually get the vaccine, and they went back and forth on that, and they actually brought up several other people throughout the episode who they felt like faked getting a vaccine. And in the bottom right-hand corner, which I believe is right on your screen too, there's the quote where they compare the COVID vaccine to Nazi medical experiments like the Nuremberg Code, which became extremely controversial statements that they made. And so, like I've said before, a lot of people really wanted this episode removed from Spotify. They wanted Spotify specifically to remove the episode since it was put onto their platform. They believed that Spotify was ultimately responsible for the spread of misinformation throughout this podcast episode, as well as many other episodes that Joe Rogan produced, along with just many of their podcasts that go onto Spotify in general. There weren't many others that were specifically called into light for being controversial as it was with the Joe Rogan Experience, but this just kind of brought the issue into a bigger light before. Spotify ultimately refused to take the episode down. They did not claim responsibility for misinformation being spread, but with a lot of backlash, Joe Rogan ultimately apologized, and he eventually took down the episode from Spotify and also took down 70 other episodes that many people were upset with for including misinformation while also harmful slurs in them as well. And throughout different social media platforms, people across different platforms like Twitter especially started a movement called #DeleteSpotify, where they were asking people to get rid of their Spotify monthly subscriptions, along with just asking people to go to different listening platforms, since Spotify specifically refused to remove its episode. And a lot of musicians, since Spotify is big with music, a lot of musicians started getting in on the movement too and started removing their own music from the platform. Neil Young was the first musician to kind of spark this movement throughout the music industry. He specifically removed some of his music because he was upset about misinformation that he claimed Spotify was spreading. Joni Mitchell eventually also removed her music from Spotify as well. There's a couple of other artists who removed their music, but I don't think that any of them are big names that you guys may know. But those are the two biggest people. As of right now, I believe Neil Young has slowly added his music back onto Spotify, but Joni Mitchell, her music is still off of Spotify. But Neil Young even asked people who worked at Spotify to leave the company because he believed that the company would eat their souls, as it says here in this quote headline. So what has Spotify done in response to all this controversy and all of the backlash about spreading misinformation on its platform? The first thing that it's done, it's made its platform rules more accessible, so it's published in an easily viewable place where all creators can tell what kind of rules they need to be following when they're posting things like podcast episodes or any other music onto its platform. They are looking to creating a content advisory and a disclaimer that can be placed ahead of podcast episodes that discuss COVID-19. This isn't just for episodes that might include misinformation about COVID-19, but just any episodes that discuss COVID-19 across all podcasts. So this disclaimer and advisory would ultimately go to another website where people can learn more from professionals about the pandemic. And it ultimately plans to highlight the rules for creators further to help them understand their own responsibility and accountability in publishing their content, which is what is going to get into the discussion for today, because that's the big controversy. Should the users who are creating content be responsible for what they're uploading, or should Spotify ultimately hold the responsibility for any kind of misinformation or harmful things that are spread through its platform? And to kick off tonight's discussion, tonight's moderator will be Patrick Parsons, a telecommunications and media industries professor in the Donald P. Bellisario College of Communications, and he will be introducing our two guests for the night. Thank you.
Again, good evening, everybody. I want to start by thanking the Bellisario Fellows and Professor Matt Jackson, whose good work together with the fellows have put this together this evening. I'm anticipating anticipating a very interesting and perhaps even lively conversation. It's my job and my pleasure to introduce our speakers tonight, starting on my far left, your right, with Professor Matt Jordan. Professor Jordan is head of the Department of Film Production and Media Studies. He's an expert in the study of the intersection of media technology, popular media, and cultural ideology. He has degrees in English, history, European intellectual history, and European studies. And he's currently co-director of the Public Humanities Initiative at the Humanities Institute at Penn State. He's particularly interested in the management and mediation of sound as a problem in global modernity, and he teaches courses, I know of them and hear very, very good things about them, the cultural history of media and media technology. He's written and spoken on issues of media misinformation. So overall, he's very well placed to give us a picture of both the nature and the evolution of the problem that we're going to be considering this evening. Our other speaker is Professor Patrick Parsons. He is Don Davis Professor of Ethics in the Bellisario College and an affiliate faculty member with the Rock Ethics Institute. His research focuses on media ethics theory, moral psychology, the philosophy of technology as applied to media systems and practices. He's also author of a field-leading textbook in media ethics, Key Principles for Responsible Practice. He has both scholarly and professional credentials, having been a newspaper journalist for about 15 years, I understand, before joining the Academy. Like Professor Jordan, he's spoken and written widely on the issues we'll be looking at, with his work appearing in both scholarly and popular outlets. He is, for example, a contributing blogger to Psychology Today, so altogether very well placed, the perfect person to offer an informed perspective on the ethical dimensions of our topic. So thank you both, gentlemen, for sharing your thoughts tonight. Final note on format. Each of our two guests will spend about 10 minutes offering prepared remarks and thoughts, followed by somewhat more free-flowing exchange. Well, I may toss in a few questions and allow them to chat back and forth. Do that for 15 minutes or so, at which time we'll open it up for questions and comments from the audience. And I guess this evening we're beginning with Matt. Professor Jordan.
All right. So I tend to look at things historically and presentist. So I both try and do both, which is say I try to use history of the present. I want to look at things to kind of contextualize them that way. So I'm going to tell a couple stories that I think are related to the Joe Rogan experience, and I think they will shed some light on what we're dealing with today. So the first is to think about the auditory experience, what listening to a podcast is like, and the best analog to that is thinking about radio, especially in the early days of radio. Radio creates what is often conceived of as an intimate listening experience, right? You're listening to something, and it was often done in an intimate space as opposed to public address, right? So you would get, for that reason, things like FDR's Fire, who shocked and outraged the public and got huge audiences of like 30 million people that would listen to his broadcast. In response to that, the FCC put certain regulations on what one could say over the medium in terms of responsibility, right, to try to curb that tendency. And we had things like the Mayflower Doctrine and then eventually the Fairness Doctrine that said you have to give equal access to things, and we have to limit the amount of editorializing that people do over this experience, because of the way in which that intimate experience was so persuasive to people, right? How you could kind of whisper things at them in their private homes and kind of lull them into a very energized and emotional state. So the Fairness Doctrine reigned as a thing that would curb this type of demagoguery, you might say, for a long time. And then slowly but surely in the 70s and 80s, you see the deregulation of that sphere, the withering of the Fairness Doctrine that made editorializing fine, right? It used to be that you had to give a balanced perspective, or not even a balanced perspective, but an opposing view perspective, which meant that if you were a bombastic editorializer, you weren't going to be able to do that the whole time. What starts to happen in the 80s is, with that being kind of waived, all of a sudden you see the explosion of a new form of auditory experience that is known as the shock jock, right? And these were largely radio entertainers who would entertain people usually during commute times, like morning and afternoon, and through livelihood and editorializing. The two most salient examples of this today, and I think there's a little bit of Joe Rogan in both of these people, or Joe Rogan has a little bit of both of these people, would be Howard Stern and Rush Limbaugh, right? These are the two most profitable radio talk people in the history. Both of them kind of earned over their lifetimes about $1 billion. Toward the end of his life, Rush Limbaugh was making $84 million a year doing this. So it's very profitable, right? And so what Howard Stern did, and they became known as these shock jocks, and they would often bump up against rules. And that precisely is what made them entertaining, right? In Howard Stern's case, he was more prurient in content. If anybody's ever listened to the Howard Stern show, you know what I'm talking about. I listened to it when I was working as a roofer in New Jersey every morning with the roofing guys. And it was, you know, Bart jokes, dick jokes, all these types of things. But it was always getting him in trouble with the FCC. And every time he got in trouble with the FCC, they would publicize him, right? They would look at what he did again. And that has become a way of thinking about why shock jockeying works. Because what you're constantly doing is saying an outrageous thing, and in terms of serial entertainment, what the person's tuning into is, what will they say next? Tune in tomorrow. He's going to say something even more rude, right? And so he cultivated this personality over time, and it became incredibly profitable. So between 1990 and 2004, the FCC fined Howard Stern a total of $2.5 million for indecent content. And again, this became instant marketing for him. Every time they did that, he would promote himself as both a champion of free speech and a kind of the alternative to the mainstream media, right? Mainstream media, think like, Walter Cronkite, very staid, dispassionate. He's the opposite, right? He is the entertainment to that. So Rush Limbaugh, similarly during the 1980s, kind of developed his persona, and he started out in McKeesport, Pennsylvania, and eventually got fired and moved his way across until he got a job in Sacramento, replacing one of the other big radio shock jocks in the early days, Morton Downey Jr. in Sacramento. And that was right at the time when the FCC relaxed the Fairness Doctrine, and you could editorialize all you want. What he realized was that you could create entertainment around political bombast, essentially. And again, just every day attacking the people that, the kind of cultural sensitivity people, women, blacks, different minorities with claims to justice. He would ridicule them and then ridicule the people who thought that they were doing it, causing huge offense everywhere, which becomes part of the marketing, right? The more people were outraged by it, the more he could say, look, I'm the free speaker, I'm the person who's saying what the mainstream won't tell you. That became part of the thing. So at the same time, you see this media conglomerate concentration, relaxing of the FCC kind of rules meant that media conglomerates could start gobbling up little radio stations and nationally syndicated. Both of these people Stern and Limbaugh got nationally syndicated, both through Clear Channel, I think, and to the end, Limbaugh worked on Clear Channel. But Stern also made this jump to a new medium with Sirius XM. Sirius at first, and then they gobbled up another satellite radio and became Sirius XM. So he got the first of these big contracts, $500 million, $1 million, $100 million a year contract with them. And this is instructive for us, is that the hope was, since this was a Sirius, anybody have Sirius? You buy a subscription to it, right? Subscription model, which is similar to the Spotify model. And so they realized that he would be this promotional vehicle to getting people to sign up. They would sign up for him, and then once in the system, they would stay there, right? So that's why they did the math and were able to realize that it would be profitable to give them that much money. So again, Clear Channel was the Rush Limbaugh thing, and kept continuing along, nationally syndicated in something like in something like 160 media markets around. And if you go into some of the locales where there is only talk radio on the AM spectrum or on the FM spectrum, dominates. This type of talk dominates, and this type of talk has a kind of feedback effect. Not only does it kind of instruct people in the news, and that's mostly what he did, was comment on news, the same kind of repackaging of it and give that slant. But he also trained people how to be political. And being political meant being what they called being a ditto head, saying ditto rush when they would call into him. Gave people an enormous feeling of political power, of being part of this large auditory community that they were part of. So Rogan blends a little bit of both of these, right? So some of his railing on political correctness could come from both. But I think another important context to think about with Joe Rogan is that he also comes from comedy, right? And comedy in terms of free speech dialogue, it has a long trajectory, right? These are often called the court jester, for instance, if you're Shakespeare, right? These are the people who say what nobody else will say. And that became part of his persona in the early days as a comedian. And this is kind of a trajectory of people that in American context, dating back to like Lenny Bruce in the 1950s, who would get, taken down by the people who were the kind of moral outrage people, right? So these are the free-speaking people who stand up to, the moral majority in a sense, and do that type of thing. And if you think about some of the people that are getting in trouble with this now, like Dave Chappelle and others, it's people who are claiming the mantle of a comedian to say what shouldn't be said in a way, to say the rest of us are too politically correct or too censored to do that, and they're just going to let it hang out. That's a huge part of his persona, and it kind of blends a lot of these elements. The other thing important to think about with Joe Rogan's personality is, again, where he came from, and not just comedy, but the big place that he got his national platform that gave him recognition was being the announcer for a new type of spectacle that emerged around the turn of the century, which was mixed martial arts, which became a dominant sports thing now. It's a multi-$100 million a year business now, which made boxing go away. And if you think about what mixed martial arts is, it's a very combative, hyper-masculine world where bloody knuckles are part of it, right? So all of these things become part of that experience, and I think you see all of this in the Joe Rogan world. So as a comedian, he kind of rose to prominence also by being as somebody who called out Carlos Mencia for being a joke thief, right? So he became like a champion among comics for saying what nobody else would say as well, right? So all of the people realized that he was smart, that he had interesting things to say off the cuff, and that he was very marketable because of these various platforms. Because a lot of the way that media works, if you've got 50 million people watching you with mixed martial art on UFC, and you have some people watching you for your comedy, you're probably going to get all those audiences to listen to you do something like a podcast. So around 2009, he started his podcast, and that seemed to work pretty well. Again, he's a smart guy. He has interesting things to say, and every once in a while, learning from these other people, he would push the boundaries. He pushes the boundaries, and you know what happens when you push the boundaries? What do we all do on Twitter when somebody says something outrageous? Post on it here. Can you believe what this guy said over here, right? We amplify it like crazy. We are the built-in amplification for this. And so we selectively choose what we're going to amplify at these people, and it tends to be the stuff that we find the most outrageous, which helps them find new audiences out there that weren't even aware that they existed, right? And so you think about a subscription model, Spotify, and the worst things about Spotify are not the Joe Rogan experience, it's the way they screw musicians, right? Like Neil Young, when he took his music off there, he probably could handle the $1.40 in a month of revenue that gets you at like 0.3 cents a click, right? But what these people all realized, and what Spotify realized, was that subscription-based model, the same way that Stern brought people into Spotify, they would get a whole new set of people tuning in for that, and they might stay. Because what we know about people on different platforms is, once you subscribe to something, do you get off of it ever? No, right? You just go, oh, I'm on Spotify, so I'm going to use that for life. They know that, right? So having somebody who has these enormous audiences, using them then to leverage that and bring more people into a subscription base is kind of where he comes from. So I think that helps explain a little bit what some of his appeal is. His appeal is also completely optimized for traffic in our digital world, right? All of the media platforms that you use have realized that optimization means whatever is going to get attention, right? And that tends to be, because of the algorithms, stuff that provokes outrage. That's going to get much more traffic than anything else. And people who learn how to use these things, like for example, the Daily Wire is the biggest publisher on Facebook, dwarfs the New York Times and the Washington Post. Why? Because it repackages news content and it makes it outrageous. It provokes attention and everybody posts about how angry it makes them and it explodes virally. This is what the Joe Rogan Experience is based for. It's optimized for maximum social media traffic, which is perfect for Spotify's model. Right? So understanding the incentive systems will help us understand why Joe Rogan is such a big deal. One other thing I want to say before I cede my time, and we can talk about this later a little bit, is to think a little bit about what it means to be authentic in the world of digital reproduction. We see really fake sounding stuff all the time. I get hundreds of emails a day from people claiming to be Nancy Pelosi or basically people who want to fleece me from my money, right? It's a kind of whole, they outrage me with something and they say, in exchange for that emotional thing, give me some money, right? This is a person who seems completely unscripted and in fact can seem more unscripted because he keeps getting himself into trouble by saying outrageous stuff. Millennials seem to be drawn to that. Gen Z seems to be drawn to that. There's something about his persona that seems more authentic in a world that seems pretty fake, right? So in a way, every time he says something that ruffles the apple cart, that's not a good metaphor, tip over the apple cart, whatever. Upset the apple cart, there you go. That seems to validate this notion that he is his own man, right? So this may be a cultivated personality thing. He's just somebody also who seems interesting to talk to. I've listened to some of his podcasts. He says some interesting stuff. He says some colossally stupid stuff too, right? And that tends to be what we concentrate on is the colossally stupid stuff that he says, right? So that's just me setting the table for what will come, and Patrick, go for it.
Perfect. Matt, that was perfect table setting. How many of you are Joe Rogan fans? Oh, come on. Serious? That few? I thought I'd see a bunch of hands go up. But, all right.
11 million a day, 11 million per episode.
Yeah, well, not in State College, apparently. How many of you have listened to him on a semi-regular basis? How many of you have caught one or two podcasts? Okay, so interesting. I am not a Joe Rogan fan. I'm not an opponent necessarily. I'm agnostic. But I do. Instead of talking about Joe Rogan, I don't. He's a fabulous conversationalist. He's a very talented communicator. But I'd like to focus a little bit more on what I think is this confluence of factors that have given us Joe Rogan. Professor Jordan's historical context is really valuable there because I think that's so important to recognize that he's coming from particular historical patterns. But I want to talk about the patterns now, what we're seeing in our digital environments now that create the dilemma that I think is Joe Rogan. And he's not special in any sense other than his hundreds of millions of dollars, but I think he's just the latest manifestation of a confluence of factors that has turned our digital discourse into an entertaining and yet I think I would argue a corrosive spectacle. And I think it's important to consider, as Professor Jordan said, our role, our complicity in that, right? And I'd like to put a little bit more prominence, more emphasis on some moral considerations, because I guess I'm the ethicist here. So I do want to raise some questions that I think we should all be thinking a little bit deeply about. So this convergence of trends that I mentioned, I want to talk about four. I want to talk about four trends that I see that are mostly problematic, but not completely so. These trends have given us some wonderful things, and yet I think we're not prepared for dealing with the negative effects, the Joe Rogans of the world. The first trend is the architecture, the very architecture of our social media. And I want to talk about social media, but I think a lot of the facts about social media design and architecture and how it channels or shapes the way we communicate can also apply to the podcast world. The second one is engagement, the nature of engagement. And Professor Jordan very nicely said that if it creates outrage, that's a metric of success, right? In our digital world, we have had the big tech define successful communication as engagement, right? The more engagement you engender, the bigger you are. Well, we now realize, and have for a long time, that engagement actually means emotionality, right? And not just emotionality, it means triggering specific emotional responses, outrage, anger, shame, right? Those bump up everybody's numbers, all right? So engagement as a metric of success in the digital world. To me, that's the second trend I want to talk about, or concern I want to talk about. The third one is cheap speech. This idea of cheap speech. There's no stakes in, well, we'll talk about the possible stakes of profiting from cheap speech, but for most of us now, saying outrageous things, right? Spreading disinformation. The cost of that is very low because of the amplification that Professor Jordan talked about, and some other reasons. So what cheap speech or what the dominance of cheap speech is doing to our digital discourse. And the fourth one is news literacy. The issue of, and the problem, I think, of news literacy. How we are, especially younger generations, are not that well equipped in terms of discerning, making important distinctions about media content, and those sort of things. All those four have created some troubling situations, at least for me, from a moral standpoint that I want to talk about. They've created what James Madison called, for James Madison, what is the worst nightmare, which is, he wrote about in the Federalist Papers his concern that factions in the new country will inflame men with mutual animosity and make them forget about the common good, right? And he hoped that the vastness of our new country was going to mitigate against that, or protect us from that. But here we are, right? Madison and others never envisioned our digital environment. So the web has left us with what Jonathan Haidt and others have called the flattened hierarchy of credibility, right? Information is, it's hard to draw on a set hierarchy of authority or credibility. There are, gatekeepers and organizations, news outlets that curate information for us are no longer necessarily key players in a lot of our media consumption. So what's happened is, another way to frame the type of content that Professor Jordan talked about is everybody's really involved in participating in what Jonathan Haidt called moral grandstanding, right? We're all kind of spouting opinions, and this is privileged, the very idea of opinion over fact. And so this moral grandstanding, to me, is also a concern. So let me go through each of these four a little bit more. So what do I mean by the architecture of social media and how it shapes or even distorts the very way we communicate? Think about your platforms. What are you guys on? You're on Snap, you're on TikTok. Some of you, the older ones at least, are still on Facebook, right? Instagram, of course. How is the very design of those platforms shaping the way you communicate, right? I mean, think about that. I think it shapes our communication in very definite ways. You know, it encourages a type of communication, and it discourages other types of communication. I think it encourages monologic communication, right? I love this. I hate this. I believe this, right? It encourages proclamation, pronouncement, one-way monologic communication. You see dialogue, you see kind of exchange of communication, but I would argue that's minimized. And the architecture of these platforms often kind of marginalize true interchange, true exchange of ideas, true efforts to really understand, oh, you know, I don't agree with that person, but what is it about them, right? So I think it privileges monologue over dialogue, right? It privileges my opinion, it showcases my opinion, and I think we need to understand how, you know, that's hindered us in some ways. I want to suggest engagement. My second one, engagement as the metric of success. We know that outrage works, as Professor Jordan talked about so well. We know that anger works. We know that shame works. There was a 2017 study on tweets and retweets that used what was called emotional or moral words, boosted the virality of those tweets by 20%. There's a similar study in 2017 on Facebook posts that found that any post that exhibited what they called indignant disagreement, right? Just, oh my gosh, that's so ridiculous. How could you believe that? Received nearly twice as much as engagement as those posts that did not feature that kind of indignant language. So we know that that kind of outrage or emotional, content works very well. My proposal is for us to think about that. I mean, how are we complicit in that? What are some moral questions I think that we all ought to ask ourselves, and what kind of changes might we want to see if we might envision a digital world where it's not all about outrage or division or shame. Twitter alone, 10% of Twitter accounts are bots, right? We have some really good research that because of the design of, say, TikTok's algorithm, everybody, not just the fringe among us, everybody tends to be rabbit holed by algorithms. And that engagement, that method of capturing emotionality and prompting those responses is part of that problem. The third one is cheap speech, the idea of cheap speech. One theorist in 1995 coined this term, and his name is Eugene Volokh. And he thought it was a great thing. He said in 95, oh my gosh, look what we're headed to. We're headed to an era where communication is just going to be proliferated. There's all kinds of sources. Audiences are going to have an infinite variety of sources, unmediated by traditional media and gatekeepers. And this is just going to be great. Well, we know what happened. Now cheap speech really refers to this idea that entertaining, trivial, titillating speech has totally displaced speech that actually matters or would be valuable for us, would be important for self-government. One theorist recently wrote about this. He said, cheap speech lowered the cost for like-minded conspiracy theorists to find each other, to convert people to believing the false claims, and to organize for dangerous political action at the U.S. Capitol, which we saw January 6th. And I would argue that feeding people reassuring lies or validating willfully ignorant opinions on a podcast, which Rogan routinely does, satisfies the craving for simplicity over ambiguity and creates a vicious cycle that encourages anti-intellectualism. So cheap speech has become a problem, right? The cost is low and the stakes are higher than ever. The fourth and final trend that I want to expressed concern about is news literacy. Younger generations are just not in the habit of consuming good journalism regularly. They're just not. And we have a lot of good data that shows how people who just rely on their social media feeds for journalism tend to be less informed about the world, tend to be less politically engaged, and tend to be more gullible, more susceptible to disinformation, right? And yet that's what the vast majority of so many people do, right? We rely on our social media feed because it's convenient, and too often we don't make the effort to actually actively seek out good journalism, much less make a habit of reading it regularly, right? So we lose the ability to discern different types of content. That's what that's done, I think, is part of the concern is that it's privileged opinion, right? It's if you're not sure what's fact and who's telling the truth, then really what you have is everybody's opinion, and what we see in social media is just this trading of opinions, and that's a natural result of that is this assumption that, well, opinions are all that matters, right? So it's this concerning privileging of opinion over fact. I even have journalism students, now who just can't conceive of how to write anything without relying on their opinions about a particular topic, and to me that's symptomatic. So those are the four things that I'd like to kind of raise concerns about. What can we do? How can we respond to some of these in a thoughtful, morally responsible way? I think there's two levels. I think we need to talk about the individual level, and we need to talk about the policy level. And there's lots of discussions going on both. But I'd just like to highlight a couple of things. None of this is going to change without some serious systematic reconsidering of policy, right? Of how we expect or how we allow big tech to define our discourse, to control misinformation or not. I think I'm really encouraged by some of the discussion about what's called demetrication, right? Going back to this idea of engagement as the single metric of success, and thinking about what are some other ways that we can encourage discourse without resorting to or opening the floodgates to simple just outrage and continued moral grandstanding by everybody. I think the discussion that we're having on the national level about deplatforming bad actors and how that would work. I don't know how that would work, but I'm glad to see that discussion happening now. People have suggested that we should make it a crime to lie about where, when, and how people vote. I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I think we're having those policy discussions now, and I'm encouraged by that. There's also, I think we can come up with other ways to raise the cost of cheap speech, because we've seen the damage that it can cause. The individual level, moving to the individual level, here's where it's about us. It depends on us. What kind of world do we want to live in? How are we complicit in some of the negative, corrosive trends? And what might we do personally, right, to take a stand or to change some behavior? And here, as the virtue ethicist in the room, I think it matters. We have a great deal of potential to think about, what kind of future do we want? What kind of discourse do we want to encourage? And how to think about architecture that would encourage that, and how do we use it, right? How do we use our social media platforms? What do we mean by being of good character, as many virtue ethicists are concerned about? What does it mean to really internalize values such as empathy, as civility, humility, conscientiousness? It's important to think about those and how those are present in your behavior, in my behavior, in all our behaviors, and have those expectations for those who dominate our modes of communication. And finally, I think I've been curious about curiosity lately. Curiosity, I think, is an underrated virtue, and I've written a little bit about it. I think show me a good journalist, and I'll show you one who's somebody who's driven by a deep well of curiosity. I'm wondering if all this confluence of factors that I've been talking about has affected our general kind of level of curiosity and has prompted a kind of a response of incuriosity among a lot of us, just to protect ourselves from information overload. And I get that, I understand that. But we also have some really interesting social science research in social psychology about people who have high levels of curiosity, how they tend to behave, and people with low levels of curiosity, how they tend to behave. And in social psych, it's called need for cognition. So people who are high in NFC are more likely to engage the unfamiliar. They have more tools to accommodate and deal with ambiguity, right? People low in NFC don't. They struggle. They're allergic to ambiguity. They want things in black and white, right? There's ways, I think, that we as educators and we as media professionals can maybe help cultivate higher curiosity responses among our population, among our audiences, among our students. And so, there's strategies that journalists can use, and they do use, right, to tap deeper levels of engagement for, say, low NFC audiences. And I think there's strategies that we can use in the classroom, and many of us do, to motivate and engage people, students, to practice more curiosity. Curiosity is not something that you're innately born with or without. Curiosity is like empathy. It's a muscle. It requires exercise. It requires use, right? Otherwise, it atrophies. So the more things we can do to cultivate curiosity, I think the better we are in terms of audiences and our ability to make important discernments in social media. Educators, I think we do have those strategies. A lot of journalists have those strategies to cultivate more curious engagement. I think we need to be more systematic and more explicit about it, and I think there's ways to do that. So with that, I'm gonna stop because I think it'd be fun to start a conversation.
It would be fun to start a conversation. First of all, as a public service announcement, I should let you know we're probably going to go another 2 hours. I have at least a half an hour. But because we have but a few minutes left, I do have a long list of questions. I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative and ask just one, and then throw it open to audience questions and comments. But this speaks to putting political philosophy, if you will, up against cognitive psychology. I was going to do it with market economics as well, but I think that'll wait for another time. John Stuart Mills On Liberty famously presented a defense for false speech on a variety of grounds. Both of you gentlemen are well aware of this, including maybe there's some truth there and maybe it will eventually show up. Assuming in a world of clear disinformation, that's not the truth. Nonetheless, he suggested that the truth is almost always better served continually clashing against falsity because it stays vibrant, it stays alive, it doesn't turn into dogma, and we benefit individually as a culture that way. But he's basing that on a classic libertarian notion of freedom of expression and being very, very careful about suppressing speech. These are if not at the heart of, very near at the heart of, our journalistic system, our press system, our political system. And there are a couple of assumptions there. One has to do with access to the marketplace of ideas. That's a conversation that I'd like to get into, but we don't have time. I want to talk with you about that. But it also relies on an assumption of human rationality, that collectively, hopefully individually, but certainly collectively, we are smart enough to distinguish truth from falsity, to separate the wheat from the chaff. And yet now we have 100 years of cognitive psychology and findings in selective attention and selective perception, confirmation bias. Both of you guys have addressed the issue of emotionality overpowering that rational sense we might engage. And so I'm wondering what your thoughts are with respect to the viability of a classic libertarian model, if indeed what we know about human beings is such that it's just not going to work. And if it doesn't work, where are we and what do we do?
We're screwed, but Matt, you get that one.
No, I'm not sure. Well, I don't think the classic libertarian model is viable, and I'll say just why, I think, which is because it always assumes that more speech will cure every problem, and that's been the way that we've dealt with this. It's just like bring more voices in, and they're eventually, you know, in the marketplace of ideas, these things will work. I think we shouldn't be talking about ideas as if they're commodities to be sold, but we can save that metaphor for another day. Why I don't think that works in today's environment is for the following reasons, which is that that notion that if we just get enough out there, the truth, and that the problem is really in the censoring of ideas. That always was the problem, that we don't want to get in the way of the marketplace, so you don't want, say, the government saying what you can't say, right? That's why we had First Amendment laws for a while. But what we've found out in terms of how political philosophy works today in the digital world is that you don't censor speech by limiting what can be said. You censor speech by dumping everything out there that can be said. Because what you do within a political realm is you create a condition where it's very difficult for public opinion on anything to be formed, for any ideas to stick in people's conversations, right? Start to get a conversation going, change the topic, get some more information in there, right? So that notion that we're going to kind of reach a consensus on this is almost impossible in the deluge of information. Think of the way that stores deal with that overload of information. They create what they call persuasion architecture, right? People are having to make choice between 14 products that are exactly the same, so we dump advertising at them to create heuristics that go quickly to those things, right? Online shopping, same thing. I can't make sense of all this stuff. Amazon has an algorithm that will put some stuff up there to the top of the persuasion architecture. Right? So our markets are never free, which is why the libertarian model won't work. But even if they were, the incapacity of public opinion to form when we're dumping information out there into the zone constantly makes all the old iterations of political philosophy not work. And where we're seeing this right now work the most is in Russia, right? This is what, there's a guy who came here to the McCourtney Institute a couple of weeks ago, Peter Pomerantsev, and he was basically talking about Putin realized that he didn't need to censor anybody. The old Russian czarist model of cracking down on communication is no longer necessary. You just let everybody say everything. And you create cyber ops people to just keep throwing narratives out there. And this curiosity will lead people to go this way, that way, and the other way, and nobody's going to reach consensus on anything.
So I guess the thing I want to press a little bit on is the notion of our ability as individuals, the nature of human nature to, again, sort this stuff out. What I hear you saying is it's just too overwhelming and we are not capable of, as human beings, of dealing with it. And that's a very kind of depressing sort of
we used to have curators, right? We used to have editors. We used to have academics that people cared what we said, you know, laments, you know. In other words, we used to have institutions that were epistemological gatekeepers and sorted truth from, and we relied on them.
Isn't that a very elitist model?
Yes. Right.
Go for it.
So there's a model out there for talking about this right now that is related to free speech. It's the democratic competency model that the academy and various institutions who want to support democracy have a there's an ethic out there to supporting what is not true and what is not true. So we shouldn't be giving, a platform to every yokel that comes around in the name of free speech. We should say, no, as institutions that care about knowledge, we should say this isn't true, right? Now, whether or not Spotify has that same obligation as a for-profit communication company that is putting on a guy who's entertaining, that's a different question.
Patrick, I know you know a great deal more about cognitive psychology and moral psychology than probably anybody in this room, including myself. Your thoughts on human rationality in this context?
Yeah, I mean, we are trapped by our own cognitive filters. I mean, we have to protect ourselves from cognitive overload, right? So
We have heuristics.
we have heuristics, we have confirmation bias, we have selective attention, all of that, which is all the more reason to emphasize the value of cultivating curiosity in a healthy way. Another underrated virtue that I would talk about too is humility. Being honest about what we don't know, and recognizing, and exercising humility in our discourse, in how we talk, in how we make pronouncements, opinionate. That might sound foreign, quite alien to most of us in the digital world now, but again, I think it goes back to recognizing what we can do personally to cultivate good behaviors, and also recognize that we are confined, we are constrained by our egos. We are governed by forces that are far beyond us. That we are governed by even subconscious influences, and all that to me says, leads me to say, you know what, we need to be more humble in our behavior and recognizing what we don't know. The Joe Rogans of the world are wonderfully entertaining, but presumptuousness, right, is one of the problems that we're suffering from. So.
Well, we have just a couple of minutes left of formal time, and so I'll open it up to see if there are any questions from the audience, and maybe even bring a microphone.
I'll bring a mic there.
Okay, great. Mike is coming up. And my guess is our guests are going to be happy to stick around for a few minutes after 7 o'clock. Is that right?
So thank you very much for what you said so far. If you guys were to design an online communications platform, we're talking about how do we set up basically the right set of incentives to get the type of engagement that would be good. What would that platform look like if you guys got to, outline your top sort of 3 or 4 things about it? How would it work? How would you make it?
Yeah.
I think we kind of get some, like Facebook can do this pretty well when they put their brain to it and they're not worried about significant engagement and revenue. Like they every once in a while, like in the lead up to the election where they were trying to tweak disinformation, they can shut it down pretty easily, right? But they lose a lot of revenue when they do that. So they could be sued as boards of directors, which is why they keep begging, please tell us what we have to do, because they won't if not. I think what we have become really good at, especially in American culture, is mobilizing emotion and motivating behavior, right? There's a whole line of research, in communications research, that is, we call it administrative research. Patrick knows something about this, which has been about how do we get people to do what we want them to do. We're really good at that. What we're not good at is cultivating deliberation, right? Which is a disposition that would open us up to listening to different opinions, waiting our turn to talk, all of that stuff. And so researching how that would work would be my first thing that I would say. To create spaces where that instead of giving you the immediate gratification of commenting, denouncing, grandstanding, all those things, that would nudge us toward better behavior. I think that actually would work, and people probably wouldn't feel the need to take a media diet. Every once in a while I just have to say, I can't deal with this anymore because I spend 2 hours on Twitter and I'm enraged, right? And then I think we all realize that that's not a good feeling. So ones that would cultivate deliberation as opposed to just motivate behavior.
Yeah. Yeah, I forgot the name of the guy at Twitter who invented the retweet like 12 years ago. He regrets that now. He's like, oh my gosh, that was a disaster. That was a mistake because it just contributed to this lobbying of opinions and arguably actively discouraged the kind of deliberation that we talk about. I think we're going to see AI play a bigger role in how people talk in social media. So you're already seeing experiments where AI is used in real time to vet or scan people's posts or tweets or whatever before they're posted and make suggestions, right, based on machine learning techniques to urge a reconsideration in some cases, or raise questions about the veracity. Do you think this is really true, or this may not be true? So we're going to increasingly see AI applications like that, which I'm kind of ambivalent about because I tend to be wary of technological solutions to problems of technology, but that might be part of the solution. I think there's other ways that we can encourage deliberation, reconsidering how we're networked with people. I'm not sure what that would look like, but I think there's some hopeful ways that we can start encourage people in dialogue rather than just monologic postings.
With significant regret, I'm going to call time on our, again, formal hour and thank our speakers.